Go ahead and hit the record button. All right, welcome everybody to this week's installment of our Dada lecture series. As always, thank you for taking time out of your busy Friday schedule to join us and hear a presentation from one of our many artists, art historians, people from within the artistic and creative field who are willing to join and talk to us and present their practice with us. So today we have, hold on one second. Now, of course, now that I've started, there's like tons of people that are joining. All right, so today we have artist Yowshien Kuo. One second, everybody's joining. Artist Yowshien Kuo, who was born in St. Louis and currently still resides and works here. He was educated in both the US and Taiwan and completed his MFA from Fontbonne University in 2014. Kuo is an active exhibiting artist and a co-owner of the artist-run space Monaco here in St. Louis. He recently exhibited with Super Duchess in New York, LVL3 in Chicago, Projects Plus, and Counter Public with the Luminary in St. Louis, Terrain Exhibitions, Oak Park, Illinois, and Granite City Art and Design District in Granite City, Illinois. He's been an artist in residence with Paul Art Space in St. Louis and is a recipient of the Regional Arts Commission Support Grant and a Critical Mass for the Visual Arts Award. His work has appeared in publications that include New American Paintings and the Scene Journal, Chicago. He has been interviewed by Yale University Radio and Cool Whip Podcast. Kuo currently holds teaching appointments at St. Louis Community College Merrimack, Washington University's University College, and Maryville University in St. Louis. So without further ado, let's all give a wonderful welcome to Yowshien.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Emily, sound is good?
Sounds good.
Thank you for the introduction. That's exactly what I've been doing with my time for the last decade plus. I'm excited to be here. Thank you guys for inviting me, Webster University, and Emily for selecting me to speak about my practice today. I got a couple brief videos with my presentation. Some of you I can see I'm familiar with, so if it gets a little repetitive because you've heard me talk about it before, I apologize for that. There's only so much I can prepare. So I'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so sometimes you might have seen me go by the name Albert, which is also on my website. That's my legal first name. And the name thing is actually quite important, where Yowshien is my middle name by birth, and it's also my Mandarin name. And this is kind of important because, you know, growing up in America, you're sort of, especially when I grew up in the 90s, you're always kind of ashamed of being abnormal. You just want to fit in with everyone. And I think anyone who considers themselves belonging to a minority group in this country, whether it be like race or gender, etc., you know, I think we all understand that notion and sort of feeling outcasted. So it was a name that I actually was embarrassed of and would tell people I didn't have a middle name just to avoid being as Asian as possible. Essentially, you know, the more white heteronormative I was, the better I thought I would sort of fit into my peer group and my social circles at large. So I decided to go by the name Yowshien instead of Albert because, number one, it's much cooler sounding and very unique, and also to embrace my Chinese and Taiwanese heritage and to bring diversity into the American landscape as far as normalizing diversity in general. And right now I'm living in St. Louis, and I have my studio in St. Louis as well. I like St. Louis just as much as any other place. I feel like you can be an artist anywhere these days. There isn't such like a push for me to be in LA or New York. right now for any particular reason, except for maybe some galleries out there. So this first image I wanted to show you is kind of important to the practice and to everything that I'll sort of show you today. This is a screenshot from a video clip that I've made. And in this video clip, it was essentially like a sketch. So sometimes I'll sketch on Photoshop or through the Adobe Design Suite, my iPhone through various apps, and again on paper like anyone else. And I'll show you examples of that in a little bit. But primarily, you know, what we're trying to do is just put our ideas down and see what happens. I think all of us, as I'm assuming most of us in this lecture right now, are aspiring artists or work within the arts to some degree. And, you know, what we're essentially, our goal is to figure out how the things that we're attracted to and interested in and curious about, how can they serve us? How can we use them, you know, to kind of push these ideas beyond our physical selves and share them with others. And so with this image, this is sort of an attempt at that. And this was just a video essentially where the ducks are just flying around. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Duck Hunt, but those of you guys who are, it's a game from the original Nintendo system where you point a plastic gun at the screen and you have to shoot the ducks. The interesting thing about the game is that the last level, so essentially when you get to the final boss, it's just like hundreds of ducks flying around the screen, and it's impossible to win. And they sort of designed it to be impossible to win when you get to the last level. It just signifies that you've completed the game once you've reached that point. But then if you know, don't shoot the ducks, there's Bulldog appears out of the bushes and laughs and points at you and sort of like grinning, sort of laughing at your failure, which I think is sort of the feeling that you get, you know, the feeling that I have with like the portrayal of Long Duck Dong in the film 16 Candles. I like the fact that both these images too are produced in 1984. So, you know, anything I can do to sort of tie ideas together, I'm always sort of making those comparisons, which hopefully you'll sort of see as I continue to show you some images. I'm gonna play a quick scene from 16 Candles so you can get the mood.
Very clever dinner. Appetizing food fitting neatly into interesting round pie.
It's a quiche.
How do you spell?
Well, you don't spell it, son. You eat it.
I love visiting with the ground.
All right, so essentially that scene at the dinner table is something that I'm sadly very familiar with. You know, sort of being in the presence of this family where you feel like an alien or alienated from everything, and there's no chance of integrating into this group, right? And you know, I'm born in the United States. When I think about myself culturally and socially as an American person. But it's challenging to live with the notion knowing that that's not going to be the case to everyone else. And essentially what ends up happening is there's a term called racial melancholia, which is something that happens to a lot of times minority groups and individuals, where in racial melancholia, you're sort of living with the aspirations of integrating or assimilating, but with sort of predetermined conditions that guarantee you'll never have that opportunity. So it's really sort of this double standard experience. And I really think like Long Duck Dong's character here is demonstrating that quite well. Give me a second, guys. I'm navigating Zoom stuff. Sorry, I am on a computer that's not mine, so a little bit different. And so this becomes really important. There's a book that was extremely influential to me called Caucasia. The quote from the book that really struck a chord to me was, "I wondered if whiteness were contagious. If it were, then surely I had caught it. I imagine this condition affected the way I walked, talked, dressed, danced, and at its most advanced stage, the way I looked at the world and at other people." And this is 100% true. As soon as I read this line, I was like, yes, this is my life. This is how I feel. And the interesting thing about, especially the time period that I was growing up in the 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, and I still think to a high degree today, you know, you are made to feel like if you discuss these things socially amongst your family or your friend group, or even, you know, Lord forbid, media, it would be very taboo, and that you were being hyperbolic, or, you know, going against any sort of like grain. And so for me, like, the conversation has shifted dramatically in the last decade for the positive. Obviously, we still have a lot of work to do, not just as a country, but as people in general. And so this really kind of resonates to me and is the foundation of a lot of my practice. And so as I'm sort of like thinking about these things, especially as just a person and as an artist, you know, I turn to things that are deeply inspirational to me. And this is something that we all do, whether you're an artist or not. But in the arts, I feel like as a visual artist, you know, how do I use this information for my practice? How does it, you know, fuel my own creativity and my own voice? And I think the main thing that I was searching for was like, I need to start asking good questions. I don't care if I have answers or not. The artwork is not there to answer any questions for anyone, or to make any strong statements. It's really just about asking questions that are important. And I, you know, when I'm kind of figuring this out, I would turn to specific artists, visual imagery, literature, and people's voices within the community at large and society that really give me that strength. And so this is just like a collage of, you know, a very small snippet of some things that have been quite monumental to my studio practice as an artist, and of course, as an individual person. And so the first thing I sort of think about is this notion of storytelling, and why is it that I believe these certain things? Because, you know, just cutting to the chase, I grew up with deep prejudices against Asian people, you know, and like, why? I'm freaking Asian. Why would I be prejudiced against my family? Why would I feel ashamed about my culture, about the way I look, my anatomy, my physiology? You know, what's going on there, and where does that come from? I wasn't born that way. And so my argument that I always make is, if I have, you know, specific discriminatory or racist thoughts about myself, then you, the people, definitely have them as well. And that there's no other argument to it. I don't see how someone could, you know, change my mind on that subject, at least anytime right now. And so thinking about that in terms of like narratives and where do we get these ideas? Where do I get my prejudices and my racism, etc.? And, you know, looking at art as someone who really loves paintings is just something that has always been a big part of my life, was looking at paintings. Robert Colescott, this painter here, becomes an important figure, especially with this piece. I wish I could show you all his work, but to keep things brief, I selected this one specifically because it is a take on this earlier painting by German painter Manuel Lutz. And you can see that this has like all the tropes of this sort of George Washington founding of America narrative that we learned so much of in history class and school, you know, for better or for worse. And so this notion that we have comparatively a new sort of view and a very creative, it's like, it's comical at the same time, but not in sort of like a, you know, I think the best comics are people who are talking about real things in a way that can reach an audience, instead of being didactic, right? And I think as an artist, that's part of like, that's a big role of creativity, is having the ability to kind of put those things together and formulate that visual language. And it's something I strive for myself. And I think Robert Colescott, with his version of George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, based off the earlier German painting, is really exciting for me. And he's well known for this in his paintings in general, painting primarily in the 60s and 70s. And so he's been a big inspiration as from one painter to another to my practice. And you'll see how that takes shape. And so as I'm growing up, I'm absorbing all this stuff just like we all do. And so again, this sort of collage of images of film and cartoons, these things that, you know, when I look at this stuff, there was a period in my life, probably in my mid-20s, when I was like, oh, this is like, I've moved past this phase. But, you know, it turns out that these things deeply impact me, and there is no sort of moving past a phase. It's like every moment is important. So it's like, why was I attracted to these things? What about The Simpsons and Ren and Stimpy and X-Men, you know, and Daria and Twilight Zone and stuff? Why was I so attracted to those things? You know, what's going on there? Again, just sort of this contemplation of decoding. Why is it that I have the beliefs and the interests that I have as an individual? Where does that come from? And these start to become really important to my practice, where I realize it's like all of these things that make me who I am, in the way that I think creatively and about the world, about narratives that make sense to me. You know, I can go on and on just like about each one of these things, because I've thought about it for a long time in the past several years. But there's one instance which I always sort of play whenever I'm talking about my work, from the cartoon Hey Arnold on Nickelodeon. Specifically this figure here, Mr. Win, who's a Korean tenant sort of in this Brooklyn immigrant housing project or immigrant housing building in the show. So I'm gonna play for you the video.
Once in a while in my line of work, I hear a voice that truly stands out, that truly moves me. Unfortunately, that's not the case tonight. I'm just pulling your leg. Such a voice belongs to tonight's featured new artist. This is Mr. Wynn's first time singing here, but I bet you a bundle it won't be his last. Let's all give him a warm, great old Opry welcome, Mr. Wynn.
Before I begin, I have something to say. It is an honor to be here. So 10% of 5,200? I love country music. I love writing songs, but I am a simple man. I have a job in a restaurant, and I like it. In fact, someday I hope to be a great chef. I don't want to be famous.
Gerald? Not now, man. I'm trying to figure out how much money we're gonna make.
This is my first time singing at the Opry.
Gerald, what?
It will also be my last time. So now I will sing my song on stage for the last time. You can offer me a diamond-plated pearl. You can send me all the riches in the world. You can tempt me with the palaces of kings. I'd give them back in a big old sack and keep the simple things. I've got the simple things. I've got the rain in spring. Got spicy chicken wings and French fried onion rings. You can line me up a mile of limousine. For me, it don't add up to a hill of beans. I got no hankering for grabbing your brass ring. It's crystal clear, I'll stay right here and keep the simple things. I've got the summer breeze.
All right, so that, I mean, I've seen that so many times, and every time I watch it, it actually gets me pretty emotional. And I think the reason that is because there is something happening there where there is boundaries being crossed that I thought could never be crossed before. Are you guys seeing the image? I'm just making sure, Emily.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, cool, thank you. And what that boundary is basically, you know, never in a million years would I would have imagined sort of an Asian person occupying that specific space, specifically a very white space, country music, and seeing sort of Mr. Win transform from his accent, like country music again, with you know, native accent mixed in with English, and then transferring that immediately to this sort of like really nice sounding country song voice is, and seeing him play guitar with the hat on and the entire get up, that really floored me. I just like never, it didn't exist in my brain. And so that really opened up this window of opportunity for me to understand what potentials I could have as an individual, as an American person, and the realities of this notion that's like, oh, I can actually create my own reality. This like, you know, all this sort of systemic things that have led me to believe and miss out on that notion and think that that wouldn't be a real thing, you know, is not real. It's not real at all. So that becomes really exciting, especially like as someone who's deeply involved in image making in general and attracted to looking at images. So kind of segueing into an image like this sort of visual portrayal of, I'm gonna go ahead and say it because I'm Asian, I feel like I can say it and it doesn't offend me. I'm gonna use the term Oriental. For me, it's not a problem. You know, it's different for every person. We're Asian Americans or Asian people are not monoculture, right? So, you know, someone might have a different feeling about that. But for me, I don't really care. I actually think it's more suited, at least when talking about these images, than saying like an Asian person, because, you know, Asia is North Korea to Sri Lanka. That's a whole lot of people to consider. But I'm specifically talking about Chinese and Taiwanese people for the most part. And so in this image, I really love these political cartoons that were done in the late 19th century. I've never saw these in history books. I never learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in history class. There was not a single mention of discrimination and actual laws that forbid Chinese people to come into the United States. And then there's, again, a plethora of sort of anti-Chinese political cartoon and conversational discourse in the media at that time. And again, as someone attracted to these images, these things are extremely exciting for me to see in terms of this notion of like, how do we represent race and what kind of ideals do we surround themselves with? So it's these types of images that, you know, I hope this doesn't happen anymore, but when I was growing up, you know, kids in school would say like, do you eat cats at home? Do you eat dogs? All these sort of stereotypes where the Asian person is, or Chinese person is made to be essentially like vermin, in sort of like this notion of filthiness. Like, you know, there's always that stereotype of like the back of the Chinese restaurant is filthy and there's roaches back there. Where does that come from, right? Why do we think that? Why do I think that? And it really sort of stems from this late 19th century period in the 1880s and onward. And this actually goes on into the 1940s, where if you know your history or you're kind of following American history closely, you'll know that, you know, America then started to create the model minority myth around Chinese people around 1950 during the Cold War. And, you know, we had different enemy at that time, right? We had Japanese and Russians and Koreans to be angry at. And so they were sort of in an effort lifting up Chinese people as far as saying like, hey, look, we do accept minorities, whether you're Black or something. So that's a whole nother conversation. But moving on with these images, I was immediately reminded of this popular image of Mickey Rooney, who's playing Mr. Yono-ishi in the film Breakfast at Tiffany's. So this is a white man playing an Asian or Japanese guy specifically. But they look identical, right? Big buck teeth, really sort of like round glasses sort of thing, hair slicked back. This sort of stereotype is very often portrayed. And some of these images I just wanted to show you from that era. There's tons of them that I've come across with my research. But if you are like me, you probably have not seen these things before prior to this, unless you were looking specifically for them. And there was lots of lynchings of Chinese people. And there's this notion too of the Asian American male, which obviously I identify with for myself, were Asian men who were coming in the United States in the early 20th century. Essentially, they were not allowed to go back to China. And when they were in the United States, they were not allowed to bring their wives or their children or their family because they didn't want them to reproduce and create essentially more Chinese, because they compared them to vermin or like the spread of rats in any society or culture. So they're really, put under this veil of emasculation. And it's sort of been that way ever since. And so here on the right is a drawing of mine with the phrase, the problem solved. The problem solved comes from a political cartoon from that era. And I really love the language from that period too. To the left is an actual image from that period. The Yellow Terror in all his glory is what it should say. And you can see that he's sort of like, this figure's hunched over this white woman as though he's like this menace to society with the gun and the knife and like what looks like a torch, like a protest type torch. And there's just this crazy scene. So I sort of took this and transferred it into like a Chinese opera type pose that was a little bit more elegant, especially with the hand gestures and the anatomy in general. And then sort of made this version of like what I thought in my head, the Chinese Captain America, and sort of like how they would fail to assimilate. So it says like America honey. So it's like English is what we say when you don't get the English right on the T. And he kind of looks like a joke, like with this scarf. It's like he's this person, I don't know if he or she, it doesn't really matter. But they're sort of confused about gender. They're confused about their identity. Everything is sort of like, in limbo, which is really the representation of a lot of these images that I've started to produce in the last couple of years. So I do a lot of drawings as well. And these are stuff that I do when I'm just like watching movies and things. Quick sketches, I normally don't really like archive these for any purpose, but I thought they'd be useful for you guys to see them. I love this little drawing. It might turn into a painting in some way, shape, or form of like the Asian guys in this like big lifted pickup truck with the flag mounted in the back, but then there's like a lightning storm in the background. This one's funny to me, the Chinese guy's new groove. With it's not even a horse, it's like some weird donkey horse. And I also make these collages as well. These are just done on a flatbed scanner of me sort of cutting things out with an X-Acto knife and just putting things together. So a lot of these images hang in my studio to just kind of figure out visual conversation. And so here, kind of talking about those cartoons again, the political cartoons. On the right is labeled a Photoshop sketch for a painting called Don't Cry for Me. So what I did was, the painting was almost done, but it didn't feel complete yet, and I didn't know what to do. So what I did was, what I often do is I take a photograph and then I'll import that into like InDesign or Photoshop, and then I'll just literally play with it to the point where it becomes absurd and makes me laugh. For me, comedy is a big part of this because, when you're going through, anyone who experiences trauma, like a good way to kind of get through it is to laugh about it. In the sense of like, if I use an art history reference in this sort of like memento mori or vanitas way of going about it and dealing with it emotionally. So here you see a lot of similarities, and this image on the left, the political cartoon, this is something that I've seen. I think it's on the wall in my studio or in my office. But I wasn't thinking about this image directly when I made the painting on the right. And the result of the painting is this underneath, where I feel like there's so many similarities to these two images now, kind of looking back and reflecting upon it just less than a year later. With the stripes, this sort of like landscape, this sun figure, this sort of silly looking person, Asian person or Oriental person, There's a little house as well. So on the far right of the political cartoon, you can see sort of darkened is a small house. We got the house enlarged on the right-hand side of my painting. There's foliage on the bottom of the drawing, political cartoon. There's foliage at the bottom of my painting. So a lot of things, I think, just subconscious are starting to sort of come through. And I think that's why it's important for, especially the students that are listening. You know, you guys, the best advice I can say is like everything actually matters in terms of like things that you're interested in. And if you realize their value, it can kind of be used as fuel for your work. As it says, a lot of subconscious similarities happening. But there's some other things that were more conscious to me when I was making this painting as far as the choices. And I just want to talk about this one because I think if you viewed my website or are familiar with my works to any degree, you'll know that a lot of the paintings that I've been doing are relatively similar to this. And so, you know, if I sort of explain this one, perhaps it'll give you insight into how to look at the other ones a little bit better. And so what's going on here is we have this Tom and Jerry scene. You know, I was thinking when I was making the painting that I wanted like an American middle-class home to be in the painting. And I didn't want to like just like drive through the suburbs and pick a house. That just seemed too random to me. So, you know, I thought about, you know, again, my childhood, and it's like, why do I already have a vision of that house, and like who has portrayed that before? And it immediately sort of came to me that, you know, I think of Tom and Jerry as like this very American cartoon where they're always running around like a house or outside of a house. And so I turned on Tom and Jerry and I was just like screen capping scenes that I thought were cool, like the artwork as far as representation is concerned. And this scene really stuck out to me, where this pie on the windowsill, like what gets more American than that? So I used that essentially as the model for the house in this painting. And then the main character comes from Heath Ledger's role as the Joker in The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan's film. And this becomes really important too, because this sort of like Asian man with the clown face and the cowboy clothes, it's kind of comical to me. I think it's funny because it's something that I don't necessarily expect to see. And it seems kind of silly at the same time. And, you know, the figure, his hair's pink, which is like just dyed hair. So there's this sort of like clown effect happening. But the way that I see the painting is that there's not actually clown makeup on this figure. It's actually we, the audience, who are projecting the clown or the silliness onto this person's face and this sort of life that they're living, this character in this painting. So I sort of feel that way too when we think about like a character in fiction like the Joker, where it's like society makes this person the way that they are to some degree. And I really love that pose too from that scene in the film. And of course in the background we have the sun. That's from the political cartoon that I showed you a moment ago. This sort of like oriental sun, which is something you saw a lot in that time, essentially saying like the Chinese are watching us. You know, it still exists today, right? We still have that sentiment with the growing powers of China. So that has never left. And for me, I put the Japanese Ronald McDonald on there. And for me, that image is so hilarious. I laugh every time I see it. It's just like shock and aloof in this like Ronald McDonald costume, but you can clearly see that they're an Asian person. I don't know why that's so funny, maybe just my sick mind, but it makes me laugh. So I kind of think it's funny to turn that serious thing of this, like the Orientals watching over America, into something kind of funny and less serious. And of course, the firearm or the rifle there leaning against the house is actually a miniature version of a large rifle painting that I did a couple years prior to this painting. You can see it in the example there in the gallery, so you can get a sense of the height of it as well. Those, again, the reason why I'm using like firearms in this Western motif has a lot to do with occupying a space that I felt excluded from, like the most exclusionatory space for a person who looks like me and, you know, exists in America like me. And speaking of the Western notion, which you see a lot in my work, especially in the last couple of years, the reason why I use that is because it is so ubiquitous to the vision of what America is in terms of reflecting on American history. I mean, just the silhouette and the shape, we don't even see these people's faces, we just see their backs turned, but we already get a sense of whatever sort of that conjures up of the story of America when you see these silhouettes and these pieces of clothing, these colors, everything about it to me, like it's just so American. So when I use it, it's not because I'm like necessarily obsessed with a cowboy or the Old West. I like Old West movies just fine, but they're not like my favorite movies out there. You know, I'm using it as a symbol for an American narrative. And what's great about it too is specifically with the Western films like this one, Once Upon a Time in the West, you know, these are known under the category of spaghetti Westerns, which is this one, Sergio Leone, who's probably the most well-known of the spaghetti Western filmmakers. He is such an important figure because he painted a portrait of America, you know, and he's an immigrant. He's from Italy. So it's kind of like his fantasy of America. I sort of see it in the same way as like the show Mad Men, for instance, where if you've ever heard the interview of the creator from Mad Men, you know, he didn't grow up in the Mad Men era in America, this rise of the advertising agency and that culture. That was his parents' time. And he's sort of writing about a fantasy of sort of hearing those stories and the portrayal of those characters. So they're a little bit hyperbolic, which for me is exciting, especially as someone who's interested in storytelling in general. And so we also get this, you know, to elaborate further on the cowboy figure, you know, this is sort of the scene where, you know, the Ronald Reagan and the cowboy outfit for me is like really funny in the sense that it's like, if we put a picture of him on his ranch in the cowboy uniform, that will convince Americans that he's got the real American heart and that he's sort of here for the people. And so that's just to kind of, you know, express further why I'm using these cowboy motifs in terms of me not necessarily caring that much about Western or like cowboy stuff, but in the sense that it represents America. And of course, we have the America's vision of Oriental. And so here we have a bunch of white actors playing Oriental people or Asian people in cinema, Hollywood cinema. And, you know, I'm just like everyone else. Actually, media and portrayals in Hollywood do mean a lot to me. And they affect me because I know how it affects everyone at large. You can see this comparison once again. Again, no coincidence that they have quite similar faces here when speaking of representation. And I have to talk about Bruce Lee really quick because, you know, I feel sometimes I have reservations about speaking of him because everyone's like, oh, like, you know, Bruce Lee, all Asian Americans love Bruce Lee and he's like the go-to figure. But it's like, yeah, he is the go-to figure because there's literally no one else. So he is extremely important in terms of representation in this country compared to those political cartoons that I was showing images of. He's the exact opposite of all of that, as I've sort of written, dismantling the Oriental stereotype in America and reclaiming space. So I want to play a really quick clip for you of Bruce Lee, and it's quite important that I share this. So give me 1 second as I adjust. Sorry guys, a little bit of a lag on my end.
I have already made up my mind that in the United States, I think some
Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN.
Sorry for the ad.
Epic stories. The largest streaming TV library.
something about the Oriental, the true Oriental should be shown.
Hollywood sure as heck hasn't.
You better believe it, man. I mean, it's always that pigtail and bouncing around, chop, with the eyes slant and all that. And I think that's very, very out of
Is it
date.
true that you were the first?
And that's the only clip that I wanted to show you about that, because it's so important just to hear someone verbally call out and say, eyes slanty, bouncing around, chop chop. And he even reverts back to this sort of, in my sense, somewhat of a racial profiling accent. And the fact that I see that on TV helps me to understand as an individual and someone who identifies as an Asian American that it's okay to talk about those things. They were not just in my head. They're very real things, you know, and especially with this notion of Asian people in America fitting into the model minority myth, you know, there's no conflict to Asian people. It's basically, we're like the litmus test to say like, oh yeah, like regardless of your race, gender, or creed, you can succeed in America. But there's a lot of problems within that system where if I were to express myself in any way, shape, or form, it would be ignored or it would not be taken seriously to any extent, because we're just like, oh yeah, just kind of go back, get back in line, right? Do your thing, which is the feeling that we have. There's a lot there, again, that I could speak on, but perhaps for another conversation specifically about that. And then I was teaching at Florissant Valley Community College, and this is very close to Ferguson. And at that time, I was working when Michael Brown was murdered. And my students were in that community and of that community. So I personally had never seen anything or experienced anything quite like that in my entire life, especially the way the country shifted after that. And it made a dramatic impact on me. So before, I was sort of exploring my own identity, or better yet, this allowed me to understand that I could explore my own identity. And so my response, prior to the death of Michael Brown and the rise of a Black Lives Matter movement, I was making a lot of like abstract paintings that were rooted in early modernism, abstract expressionism, and design-orientated things, sort of like my feelings of aesthetics. However, after I witnessed what was happening that year in 2016, it felt, for me personally as an artist, I felt like I wasn't communicating things that I was actually feeling clearly through abstract works. So my early attempt to kind of figure out who I was and what I was feeling was through paintings, including this one called Still Boxing. And all the people in the background sort of have their hands up it looks like they're cheering, but it's really the hands up, don't shoot that was going around that year, is the way I sort of see it. And then there's members in the audience who sort of look like white businessmen. You know, they're really calm and everyone else is sort of in dismay. So if you kind of like look through the crowd, there's all these like soldiers back there too. And that was in a response to, again, I love painting. So this is a painting by Thomas Eakins, the American painter from the Hudson River School. And then of course, one of his disciples, George Bellows. And they're both seen as like American realist painters of the early 20th century. And so I was thinking about the image of America through the lens of painting, what activities are involved. And this still boxing painting is sort of the culmination of all those things coming together. And also deeply influenced by cinema. This is a photograph by the filmmaker Stanley Kubrick, I just stumbled upon a book of his that was mostly his black and white film photography, which motivated this painting as well. And then I began to think about myself and sort of who is doing this really well. Who is capturing the sentiments that I'm experiencing and communicating these, and who has been doing it for a long time. So I started to become really attracted to the painter Horace Pippin. Again, I wish I could show you, I could probably talk like an hour just on Horace Pippin or any of these images. And of course, Jacob Lawrence. Jacob Lawrence is an artist that I was attracted to as an art student, but I wasn't really thinking about a lot of these things when I was a student, at least not in my artwork too directly. The vocabulary and the mental articulation for this type of conversation had not surfaced to me. At that time in my life, I was still sort of internally struggling with it and didn't really have any sort of voice. But I began to revisit Jacob Lawrence because I've started to get really attracted because I think he's doing it so well, where you don't need sort of like this realistic portrayal to really send the message. And for me, that's what communicates well in painting, and all those sort of like cartoons that I sort of showed images of, is that they deliver a very strong message without sort of this sense of realism. And at the same time, I like the notion that our reality is sometimes so stifled or so problematic that you have to step outside of reality to show reality itself. And Jacob Lawrence does that really well. It also reminded me a lot of a favorite rock band music video that I liked, which is Radiohead. This is a music video for their song Paranoid Android, off like a 1994 album. And there's this bar scene here with all these seedy people in it, and sort of like all this sinister stuff happening behind the scenes. And it reminded me a lot of seeing the Jacob Lawrence reminded me of that. So making that connection to me is just exciting in general as far as like a studio practice is concerned. And we get to images like this, where this is important to my work as well, because the people that occupy this type of space in this country are the people that I fear the most. Before, when I was younger, I wasn't, like most young people, that invested in politics. So it was not a political fear then. It was a fear of being physically or verbally assaulted, or taken advantage of due to my physiology. And so, I was raised where my parents were like, yeah, don't stop when you're driving through those places, just avoid them at all costs. They are dangerous people. And then the irony is, of course, like they tend to feel like they are holding down the fort for America. And this is all sort of ubiquitous to us now, especially within the last 6 years. But I wanted to occupy this space because, these are the type of people who basically exclude minorities, right? And they consider themselves American. I consider myself an American. I don't feel excluded from this country. I feel quite patriotic, as a matter of fact. And then there's like images like this where why does patriotism become like you have to become some soldier or defender who's threatening, and an image like this from my point of view tells me that you are defending the country for one type of person. So it has, again, this is just my point of view, but it feels very much like a totalitarian power system happening here, which goes against the Declaration of Independence and all our constitutional writing. So I started paintings like this. This one's called I Don't Usually Praise Guns. The point of these paintings is essentially for me to start to figure out how do I occupy a space that I'm afraid of. The people that I most fear in America, I just want a taste of that too. So this was my early attempt in 2017, was making these large lifelike paintings of real American firearms. And I'm not too savvy with firearms. I don't have that much experience with them, but I have a lot of experience reading about the history of them in the relationship to the country. At the same time, there was a lot of debate at this moment of gun ownership in America, because there was, the sudden rise of a lot of shootings that hasn't really stopped since then. So I thought it appropriate. And I also did paintings like this. This is how the West was won. These are all hats that historically, through American and or European power, have in some way, shape, or form eliminated or altered the course of another person's culture or another culture's general society or role in the world. And so to me, when I see this painting, it's kind of scary. It's actually like in some ways like a horror film, if you want to view it as that point of view. And I'm almost wrapping up, guys, just so you get a sense of time. I got like one or two more images to show you. And with this one is called Living with the Great Fear of the Period. A couple motifs that I'll sort of explain in this as far as what you're seeing. First off, the border is known as toll painting. I really like this idea, and to me it was relatively new from like 2017 when I was in the Smoky Mountains for the first time. And I met a woman, an older woman, and we were talking, and she found out that I was interested in painting and art. So she said, come see my paintings. So I went to her house, and on her walls were a bunch of these types of toll paintings. I didn't know what they were called. She told me that they're called toll painting, and I started researching after the fact. And I really actually quite admired them because they were so, number one, they were free from sort of the European history of high art making, you know, Renaissance and afterwards into like modernism. It's, you know, free from Hegel and all the sort of German philosophers that are writing about high art and the minimalists, etc. And it just seemed like an art that came naturally to people to use it as a form of, you know, having a sense of identity or culture, where you came from, what you value, and using art in that sort of decorative way after, you know, being in school where you get all high-minded about it for so long, was really refreshing for me to see. And I really saw a great continuity and beauty in that sort of form of art making. It's like anyone can do it. Simultaneously, it reminded me of Chinese and Oriental pottery, as far as just these decorative things. Like, yeah, of course, the flowers and specific plants have, you know, certain meanings, but it's not necessarily just about that. It is just a sense of decoration and arts for decoration in terms of having something attractive in your life and your day-to-day experiences, which I love that sort of humbling notion that you sort of lose, I feel like, in art school sometimes. And of course, I got to represent my love for the tradition of painting. So I put in the still life, the skull, or the vanitas, or memento mori, for those of you guys who also are reading into paintings quite frequently in the background. And the snake itself comes from, whenever I use the rattlesnake or any snake, it is, for me, the symbol of America and the original 13 colonies, or you could say colonialism. So that's what it represents in the painting. So that's why this painting is called Living with the Great Fear of the Period. And I've also set these paintings up in certain exhibitions like this one, where they're mounted to moving boxes, in a sense that, you know, what I was hoping the boxes would communicate to the audience was that we are in a perpetual state of assimilation, in which it is an impossible goal to obtain due to the regulations and histories that have been set before us. And so I wanted to show you this because this painting is the great fear of the period. The other one, Living with the Great Fear of the Period. So under the veil of essentially a colonial state, and all the stories and histories that have accompanied that, to put it briefly. But this one is interesting because it's meant to be quite big, and it's about 11 feet tall, and it protrudes off the walls. So it's this notion of, what do they call it online? Like man spacing or something, where people spread their legs on trains and stuff.
Man spreading.
Man spreading. So it's supposed to man spread into the space. Like, it doesn't really quite fit anywhere and comes off the wall. And it's also an entirely erect rattlesnake, which you would never see a snake totally erect like that. So that's unusual. But it's really designed as a piece as a whole, with the astroturf on the bottom, to resemble male genitalia as well. That's the pink color specifically for Caucasian male genitalia. And I'll let your imagination take it from there. And so here's some more installation views just to kind of show you. I've put it in front of a painting to kind of like, whatever you said again, Emily, man something in front of the painting. So that is kind of like the intention of it, sort of blocking everything. And just to kind of show you how images are being used and reused in the paintings, you know, this pose comes directly from this Marlboro ad. And just to speak really quickly on this painting, you have a hunter now, but in my painting, but the deer that they have caught is like a little fawn that's kind of cute. It's not like a big buck. So the opposite of like big buck hunter. And that's this notion of, again, trying to kind of get with the culture, but still missing, like not doing it right. And so it's kind of comical to me in that sense where it's like, oh, we just like never get it right. You were close, not close enough. So there's a lot of that happens. The details as far as like the plants and the foliage, flowers to me is something that I just personally really love. So I use always plants from specific regions. These are all native plants to Missouri that I painted. And each painting has some type of scenario like that if I am going to show that. It's not just like a random choice. I've also made sculptures as well. These are sinister cowboy hats. And essentially what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to manipulate them enough to where they're recognizable and at the same time unusual or strange to us. They intentionally trying to look threatening because it's sort of this, again, imagining of historical narratives, reimagining of them and saying like, okay, so the cowboy is portrayed as this like heroic type figure in our culture. But what if we like switch that point of view and say like, okay, so what actually happened is the cowboys are coming in, killing these people, right? Taking their land or whatever. Is that really that heroic? Or is that actually something quite threatening and scary? Like, is not the cowboy the alien sort of coming in and blasting everyone, right? Like in a sci-fi movie. So, you know, if we have that dual narrative, I think it's a little bit more constructive than just kind of seeing the American cowboy as a hero. Therefore, they're called sinister hats. So they're supposed to be made to look kind of threatening and alien at the same time. There's a dozen of those that I made. These are just the two that I liked most personally. And I've also done other things. These are made out of ceramics. So the one on the left is a John Deere tractor in the tradition of toll painting or decorative painting as described earlier. The one on the right is a 65 Mustang GTO. And then that is again sort of decked out with toll painting and object painting. And those are just little things. I mean, sometimes you just got to get it out of your system. And I quite like those little pieces as well, along with the hats. There's not only painting, there's a lot of video work, which I'm not showing today because I personally don't think my video work is that great. And so finally, there's this painting, Slipped in Hope. Again, I'll do everything I can to wrap this up really quickly. So this is what I've been recently painting, and they've sort of taken on this more psychedelic edge, you could say, is the space and abstraction along with the narratives, which is for me quite exciting in the sense that I can be more playful as a painter. But what we have here, the way that I see this, obviously read into these works however you want. That's the invitation. But sort of, if you were to ask me what prompted me to kind of create the image, it is an Asian man in flannel with jeans punching out another Asian naked man. So that action there is essentially, for me, like someone who is successfully integrated or assimilated into a culture, but when that happens, you have to lose yourself, your like real self, or a big part of you is lost or destroyed. So to me, that's the exact same person. We're just sort of witnessing the psychology of their mental state. And then there's this sort of woman here who's in plaid, and she's already one step ahead of this guy who is, she's already fully assimilated. The weird pickle-like figures are, again, like the powers that be, and they are pleased with her assimilation, and they are getting more pleased as the two male figure interactions are taking place above her. And then you have the shooters in camouflage, Asian guys sort of hunting, but it's hard to know whether they're sort of shooting at I'll refer to them as the powers that be, or the Asian person. Are they shooting at the assimilated version of that person, or the eliminating the original form of their true identity, the naked person? And that's just up for debate. And at the same time, it reminds me, again, just to kind of pull things together, of a video game that I liked as a kid, Street Fighter 2. And later iterations of Street Fighter, they created a character called Fei Long, who was just based off Bruce Lee, essentially. And what's cool about Street Fighter is that it was a game of people from different countries, and then each stage was designed, like the artwork in the stage was designed to represent that country, which I always thought was kind of cool. And, fits quite well with my practice. And Guile is the American sort of army soldier character who always has like USA stuff in his fighting stage. And this notion of like Fei Long, or like this Asian man Bruce Lee figure fighting this like really brute, blonde-haired, blue-eyed American soldier is kind of interesting to me, especially once the film, what is it called? Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino from like a year or two ago came out. And then there's a scene in the film where Brad Pitt, who's obviously the handsome white man, beats up Bruce Lee in the film, right? And Bruce Lee is supposed to be seen as this great fighter, but he kind of is made a joke. Essentially, I know it's a comedy film, and it's just, I don't like hate the film or anything like that for this, but it's just an interesting kind of conversation to contemplate as far as a scene is concerned. And I feel like that's the history of Asian Americans in this country. It's just getting beat up, whether it's physically or mentally, and just sort of put down or put in place. There's no chance of rising to an equal status, forever alienated. This is what I meant by racial melancholia. And lastly, this is the last image I'll show you. I think it's kind of important. This piece is currently at the Contemporary Art Museum on view till February. So if you guys want to see these works, make sure you get on their website and schedule a visit just for COVID safety. This is Naturalist Prometheus Hating the Birds. The title comes from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who from his novel Between the World and Me, which many of you hopefully have read or know of. And in that, he uses this quote, naturalist Prometheus hating the birds, which comes from Greek and Roman mythology. And for those of you who know mythology quite well, you'll know that generally there's a lot of sort of like subtle iterations of each tale. Prometheus is given the task to sort of deal with the humans on Earth. And what he wanted to do was give the human beings the gift of flight, because he thought that would be the best. However, he goes to Zeus and he's like, well, how about we give them flight? Essentially, Zeus is like, well, I already gave that to the birds, so that one's taken. And Prometheus feels quite disgruntled about this and upset because the good abilities were already occupied for the birds. So he gives human beings fire instead. So essentially what we see here is there's a fire. There's a bunch of dead animals. We see a central figure wearing clothing that's modeled after the Boy Scouts of America uniform, and it's really small, as though they had been wearing it their whole life and didn't really get a larger version of it. And they're chained to the land. They're sort of screaming out in dismay with their gun on the ground and the hat sort of flying off. The hat is that safari hat that Melania Trump wore in Africa, which is where I got sort of that notion, which is just so silly in lots of ways. And the animals are all dead. And so this person like went out to hunt to try to prove themselves as this Boy Scout, as this all-American type figure in every aspect, but ended up killing some cute cat and dog and bird and raccoon. So like things that you don't normally hunt, even a horse. And then they're sort of like realizing that they did it wrong, and they're like lost themselves completely. So it's this moment of almost like a Caravaggio scenario, a moment of realization where everything has gone wrong. And this like sort of white glitter horse comes in. The horse again represents, I'll just say, the powers that be, and in the painting. And there's this notion of raping of culture and land, which is why the horse has a erection. And then there's the snake, which you guys know why I'm using the snake. It's cut up just like the join or die imagery. And then the whole thing is sort of like a reverse Noah's Ark type scenario in my mind. And then the black border surrounding it, that textured surface, actually has gold flakes in it. That is just sort of to commemorate the San Francisco gold rush and the influx of Chinese Americans coming into this country and the contribution of the Transcontinental Railroad to that degree. And the leopard print is this notion of exoticness. What is the price of, achieving some type of exotic status? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So a lot of questions there, but I wanted to show you that because this is one of the more recent pieces. And I know I was talking for a while, which usually happens, so I apologize for that. But do you guys have any questions you'd like to ask?
All right, guys, we still have, quite a few of us here. First of all, I just want to say thank you.
No problem. Sorry it went on a little bit long, but I was trying to talk as fast as possible.
Well, I mean, that's one of the benefits of sort of doing everything sort of remotely is that when we do go long, people can just kind of like peace out pretty quietly. So yeah, I want to open it up. And does anybody have any questions specifically about certain types of work or maybe some of the imagery that is that Yowshien kind of includes, or even just questions about inspiration and sort of where you draw, source imagery from, because it seems like it's very widespreading.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer anything. It can even be non-art related stuff.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
How do you approach or I guess viewer critique when an artist uses appropriation? Because you use Western culture and stuff, and I think you do it really well. And I was reading this article about Christian Marclay, and there was a portion of it where the interview is talking about how they were in Japan and he cut up a bunch of manga to use it as inspiration. And that's something that I've loved since childhood. And reading that article kind of made me feel uncomfortable. So how do you feel about other artists appropriating or your approach to appropriation?
That's really good and a great question. I could specifically talk about let's say I'm not Japanese and let's say I start to feel quite inspired by manga and its imagery and its artwork. The way that I would try to use it is to say okay, I really like this, but what is my relationship to it? Not in terms of me liking it or not, but my actual relationship as far as where I come from, who I am, where does that come from? What is that? What stories do we share? What stories are not mine to tell, as part of it. And then as far as me, kind of using that in terms of a Western accoutrement, I kind of see it as that one for me is more fair game. I've had people criticize my practice and say hey, you're essentially appropriating my white culture. But the argument gets shut up pretty quick because I'm you mean American culture? And they're yeah. And I'm I'm American. It's my culture too, right? So it's why did you think that it only belonged to you to begin with? And that's the whole point of the work too, is I really generating that part of it. So again, me using it, I'm thinking about my actual relationship to it and its narratives and stories, as far as how adjacent is my experience with that. Hopefully that answers your question, Joe.
Yes, it does. I appreciate that.
Well, and I think it's also pointing out to those people white culture is a culture of appropriation. Historically, we just go in, take crap, pointing out to, people that very, very little of what would be considered white culture is even our own. It's stolen.
I think it's also important, the perspective that you're coming from, or the intention, where your spirit is when you're expressing that. But my question was, where do you begin to, I guess, make the connection, put your artwork out there in such a way that you're not exploited in a business sense?
That's a really good question. That's something I'm kind of still navigating, to be honest. It's really a touch and go type scenario. And based on, if I think I, understand your question correctly, and you can correct me if I'm not responding correct. It's really just based on the relationship with the audience, and our, at least as far as like showing the work with the curators and what type of establishment, you know, is I'm showing, or even when I sell work, I'm very careful to who purchases it, in the sense that I have to really sort of know why they're interested and for what reasons. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, yes.
I had a question that someone else also posed in the chat. I was curious as to how and why you use bone ash in a lot of your paintings.
Oh yeah, I love questions like this. I love technical making stuff. Bone ash is, I like it because it makes me think of, well, dead animals, because that's what it is essentially. And I like the fact that almost like the way that a ceramicist uses types of elements in clay and natural materials, I like how it goes into the painting that way and exists there. But as far as like a more technical aspect of its use, it actually dehydrates paint quite significantly and it mattes it. So essentially, like if anyone is listening and you're familiar with paint, you'll know that the way that they matte a paint or get it to be like a more satin type surface is by adding something, usually it's chalk, not often bone ash, like calcium carbonate, because what it does to the molecules is it makes it really rigid, and so it absorbs light instead of reflecting light. And therefore, like gouache paint, for instance, compared to your watercolors, the gouache has calcium carbonate type stuff added to it so that it's actually molecularly more dense and rigid, so it appears to be very satin or flat. And so I use it for that purpose, along with the sort of notion of just knowing that there's animal bones in the painting.
Say, I gotta ask, has the COVID-19 pandemic ever been an inspiration for you?
That's a good question too. COVID-19 for me personally, it has tremendously. Like, I hate to say it because I feel like I'm on the wrong side of the argument here, but I've quite enjoyed everyone not going outside and society sitting still, because I know, at least for me, it has allowed me to really fully realize what types of things are important to my life personally and how to spend my time and how to value my time as well, especially as an artist, like giving myself a lot more worth than I used to, instead of just being someone sort of chasing after an art, you know, what I think being an artist is. And so a lot of that has really sort of, a lot of that clutter has sort of lifted for me during quarantine period. And I'm also very introverted. I just like people to leave me alone so I can think about my paintings and stuff. I don't like getting texts or phone calls or anything like that. I just like literally want to watch TV and sit in my studio and make stuff, which I think most of us can relate to.
I was actually talking to Troy Aiken, who had a studio at Intersect with you the other day, and I told him that you were giving a talk, and he was like, "Yeah," he's like, "All Yowshien wants to do is just paint. Like,
Yeah.
that's his number one thing. He just wants to be in the studio and just paint." And so I think that work ethic, you know, sort of divides and conquers how a lot of us have experienced this.
Yeah, you know, and I think that's what I did as a kid, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like growing up, I loved sitting in my room and just drawing pictures. I could do that for hours, right? It's like time went away. So nothing has changed.
All right, I guess we have a lot of people that are sort of leaving because we do have classes starting, you know, on the hour again. I'll open it up. Does anybody have one final question?
I have a question real quick. I listened to one of your interviews, and I heard you saying something about how you know, you kind of create your stuff kind of with this Asian American perspective, but you, as a visual artist, want your work to kind of give a voice to any minority out there. And I was curious, how specifically do you see your work, or how do you at least foresee your work doing that?
The only way, and that's a great question and something that I am quite adamant about, is that Like, number one, I can't speak even for Asian American people directly because it's just my experience. Again, not considering people within monoculture, I think is quite important. But you know, what has given me the strength to do the work that I'm doing is other people telling me from other communities that it's important for them to hear these perspectives and see these things because it allows them to think it's okay for them to also share. And I think that's really the whole point, is to say it's like, okay, like we're here for you, right? We're here for each other in this sort of empathetic way. And so if anything, hopefully it gives people strength to say it's like, okay, this person is like so adamant and dedicated to exploring this. Why can I not do the same, right? For my personal experience. And then like, I would love to hear that too. So that's, and then it becomes like almost like a symbiotic relationship where we help one another grow.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Good question. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And I mean, I'm going to go back to that first little drawing that like you presented where it's kind of like, there's some awesome stuff that you're doing in that cartoon drawing where like gender is also being explored and played with and questioned. And I have made some of those connections about like, about, you know, what this idea of like masculinity is in some of like your work that I've seen, I think since 2017. And so like, I think you're sort of creating a space for that dialogue as well.
I really am. And to, you know, to be quite honest, it's a conversation that I still have a personal difficulty articulating in my own thoughts. So I'm still figuring that out. So I don't really talk about it too much because I can't speak on it.
Yeah. Well, that's more me offering that I see a broad dialogue in what you're presenting, and I'm really excited by it. And yeah, just it's something that I've always like really appreciated whenever I look at your work, because it's something that like I try to, you know, think about and, you know, push in like my work as well. So
I'm happy that comes through. I appreciate you.
it does.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Well, we went long, but thank you everybody for sticking around. And yeah, again, Yowshien, that was awesome. Thanks for taking time out of your Florida vacation to to talk to us.
I'm gonna go to the beach right now. So
yeah, do it.
Right over there. There's palm trees outside.
Go do it. You earned it. All right, everybody. Remember, we've got our reading discussion meeting at 2 o'clock. So hopefully some of you guys join me and we can talk about fear. But until then, you guys have a great day.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to speak to you guys and answer your questions.
Yeah, thanks for coming. All right, Yowshien, until you get back to town, I'll talk to you later.
Okay, see you guys. Have a great day and weekend.
Okay, bye.